Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Karen with Mended Hearts. We are so happy you're joining us this afternoon for our advocacy webinar. We are also going to share some patient stories with you and our experience in working with the NIH. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Attendees, you are in a listen-only mode. Please be sure to type your questions in the Q&A box. Of course, this is being recorded. It'll be available on our Mended Hearts website and our YouTube channel. We'd like to take a moment to thank all of our members of the Action Network here at Mended Hearts. Thank you for your support in order to bring this programming to the community. Joining us this afternoon, we have Lindsay and Chris and Ryan, who are with Troutman Strategies. We partner with them for our government affairs issues and concerns. And I will pass it off to Chris. And we'll start with Chris, and then we'll move into the patient stories.
Oh, I think I'm going to kick it off, Karen,
Oh, okay.
and
All
because
right.
Chris is going to be taking the meat of the meeting today,
Okay.
so I want to take the easy part and get to thank everyone. So
Very good.
that's the pleasure I get to have here. So
Awesome.
thank you for allowing us to set this up, and we have a really good presentation today. And honestly, it was such an awesome visit back in February. We have been talking about it and talking about it with staff. Enjoyed having the whole group. Everything ran smoothly. Even last year we had our challenges. It still went really well. We had a lot of successes even come out of that visit. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But we're also going to discuss why NIH, the National Institutes for Health funding, is important to Mended Hearts and all of our members and advocates. We'll get into NIH by the numbers. We'll talk a little bit through some of the programming and what we're going to be looking at. We'll go into our congressional request. This is super important. I can remember being a staffer and alongside of my teammates receiving all sorts of inquiries and requests for NIH funding. It's one of the most highly sought after agencies for key funding that helps save lives. And it gets a lot of attention and it is a huge budget, but also coming in with a request related to heart advocacy, super important. We'll talk through some of the NIH successes and the research behind that and how people do get access to the funding or get access to making sure these programs operate better for those that are intended to receive the funding that NIH gets. I think talking through patient stories is going to be really important to all of this. I think that is the true essence of what this organization does. It is about your stories and about how you're impacted in your day-to-day lives and where the federal government can be there to help and support. And then we'll allow time for some questions. So next slide, please. Okay, Hill Day recap, my favorite. This was so fun. I don't think there's anybody, we don't have a single fly-in like this. I don't think I've ever done anything like this, our team either. We just had so much pride in it and just everybody just super champions. And it's a hard day. It's hard on patients. It's hard on families, but it's so worth it and so fun. And you can see how we're invigorated by having all of these meetings. And it doesn't happen magically. We do create the magic on a single day of having, nearly 40, 50 people marching the Hill. So on the 25th, we had the group. I hosted dozens of advocates in Washington to meet with these congressional offices and key committee staff. I think that's also really important because those are a lot of the decision makers on what advances through the congressional and legislative processes. So over the course of the fly-in, the advocates participated in over 38 meetings. That is quite the day. I think that might be a record. Discussing essential issues for both Republicans and Democrats, including 11 Senate offices. We like to keep track on numbers so people can remember because I know their feet remember. 21 House offices and 6 meetings with key House and Senate committee staff. And those 6 meetings covered every single committee office that we wanted to meet with. We have to decide who to meet with. There's various committees across Congress that might touch our issues, but we picked the 8 committees that manage our specific issues. Our discussion topics included the Inflation Reduction Act, which had impact with the EPIC Act and MINI Act, Safe Step Act, the 340B program reform, Women's Heart Health Expansion Act, which I think we had some success following our day there, The OPTN that Glenn so passionately gets to help and work on with us. We enjoy that advice and strategic expertise there. And then, of course, NIH programs and funding, which I think we all got nods from every single office anytime you bring up NIH, because they know how critical it is and they meet with many groups, but not groups quite like ours. All right, next slide. Okay, I think this is when I get to hand it over to Chris, because he really did put a lot of his heart and soul into making sure that you guys have a really strong understanding of NIH and where the funding matters for Mended Hearts and the advocates, and how we're going to walk you through these processes while we're in the middle of, really deep in the middle of appropriation season and managing all that we have to do with Congress, where, yes, you guys are hearing a lot about shutdowns, you're hearing a lot about this, about that. But I just want to remind everyone, the government is fully funded other than one bill, an agency that's covered under that bill, the Department of Homeland Security. It does impact our travel day-to-day challenges. Believe me, I've had to travel every single week this year. But for the most part, it should not impact at least the current existing funding lines, because the Labor, Health, and Human Services legislation was passed and is fully funded. But we are going through the next annual process for FY27, which we're in the thick of that. And Ryan, our appropriations expert, can talk a little bit about the appropriations challenges and what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I think this is the good time to hand the baton over to Chris Baxter.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Just to kind of reiterate some of the things that Lindsay was talking about, the whole point of this webinar is to really get into some of the nitty-gritty of NIH, its funding and its programs, and to the stories that have already impacted Mended Hearts advocates before, because during our flying, we did have a really good response from all of the offices that we met with, on the topic of NIH funding, and ultimately it led to a specific request, which I'll get into shortly here. And it's something that we can really build on into the future. So very excited about that. But, back to basics, why is the NIH important to Mended Hearts and its advocates? It is really the premier research institution for the federal government. It does the bulk of the research and the clinical trials for anything heart related. Yes, there are other agencies that do stuff. FDA has the research programs, CDC has the research programs. You have ARPA-H, which is, of course, the Advanced Research Projects for Health. They have their own set of research that they're doing, but it's really the NIH that conducts the large majority and bulk of this research, at least at the federal level, that then trickles down to a lot of the research institutions. So, as I kind of mentioned, they're really the ones that are making these discoveries, doing the clinical trials, and advancing those treatments that are really going to make an impact to our heart and cardiovascular patients. And then, we've talked about the NHLBI, which is, of course, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute a lot. That's the one of the major institutes at the NIH that is really doing, the bulk of the funding within NIH on the both pediatric and adult research, covering the whole, gamut of heart-related issues such as heart attack, stroke, CDH, and heart disease, excuse me. Next slide, please. So great. What is the actual current status of NIH funding? So this year, Congress funded the NIH at $47.2 billion. That is a slight increase over the last fiscal year. And just to put this into some context, that funding number has been relatively flat. It's kind of hovered above that $47 billion mark, give or take a couple $100 million, which is, of course, a lot of money, but it's really hovered around that $47 billion mark since around fiscal year 2023, so about 4 years ago. But more importantly, that's up pretty significantly from fiscal year 2015, where it was really only around $30.3 billion. So you can really see when advocacy kind of took a strong stance here and started, pressuring lawmakers to increase funding for the NIH, where you see that really significant increase from 2015 up to 2023. Specifically for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, that was funded at just under $4 billion. Oops, sorry, can we go back one slide? That was funded at just under $4 billion this year, or it's roughly 8% of total NIH funding. And again, just to kind of put that into a little bit more context for you, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see all the major institutes that are housed within NIH. NHLBI is by no means the biggest, but it's also by no means the smallest. But I think getting into our request on the next slide, we'll kind of get into what we're doing to try to bump that number up a little bit more. And the other thing I'll say on the actual funding side of things, last fiscal year, the president's budget request had a pretty significant reduction for the NIH. It was roughly a 40% cut. We're actually expecting to see the president's budget request for the next fiscal year on Friday. We think there's no reason to think that we won't see more drastic cuts in that request. But I just want to remind this group here that at the end of the day, it's congressional appropriators who are making that decision on how much the NIH actually gets funded. As I mentioned, we saw a resounding opposition to that cut last year with what Congress provided NIH for this year. Not to get too much into the numbers on these things, because at the end of the day, it is about the ultimate patient results that we see from this research and clinical trials. But it is interesting to see that there's significant economic output for every dollar of funding that you see NIH get. These are numbers that the United for Medical Research puts out every single year. This year, they basically concluded that for every $1 of NIH funding that Congress provides, you get $2.57 return in economic activity. So even more specifically, last year, out of all of the funding that NIH received, they awarded $3.6 billion of that for research grants for organizations like research universities and et cetera. So out of that $47 billion that they got last year, nearly over $36 billion of that went directly to research institutions, which ultimately ended up supporting close to 400,000 jobs and driving a total of over $94 billion in economic activity. So, again, I hate putting this into dollars and cents, but it is interesting to me to really see that return on investment for every single dollar that Congress provides to the NIH. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So getting into what our specific request was from this year, as I mentioned, for our fly-in, we had a lot of really good conversations about NIH funding, and that sort of led us to put together this request for this fiscal year. So, after our fly-in, we decided to submit specific requests to the leaders of the House Appropriations Labor HHS subcommittee, which is, of course, the subcommittee that funds all of these organizations. So we put in requests to Rosa DeLauro, who's the ranking member, and to Robert Adderholt, who's the chairman. And specifically what that was a $5 million increase for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, specifically targeting congenital heart disease research. I sort of said this when I started speaking here is, regardless of the outcome that we see for this on this fiscal year, this is a great foundation for us, for Mended Hearts and our advocates, to build on in the future. So, very excited to see that grow and be a part of that, real economic impact that we see for increasing NIH funding. And the other thing that we did, aside from the, specific funding line, we asked for report language, which was really asking, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to really focus that new funding on CDH and provide a briefing to the Approps Committee, roughly 3 months after this language passes, hopefully, on what they're doing to really identify the gaps in their current research for CDH. So very excited for that. And of course, we'll keep this group abreast of, when and if we get that language in this year's appropriations bill. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So a lot of information on the screen. I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is just like a light smattering of all of the success stories and ongoing research that the NIH, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, is currently ongoing. There's just so much that they do. It would take the whole hour to go through everything. But just to highlight a couple things on this list here that I think is really interesting. The very first bullet, the Framingham Heart Study. This is a 70-year study that the NHLBI has been undertaking, and it's really been the foundation for how we understand and treat heart disease. And this study has reduced the death rates from coronary heart disease by 71% since this study has started. And then the other one that I find really interesting is, the very last slide, these really next generation cutting edge technologies. There's really interesting things that the NIH, the NHLBI is currently undertaking. Just to name a few, you have these dissolvable or resorbable stents that disappear after your surgeries. You have advanced imaging techniques and tools that are helping to detect heart disease earlier. These three-dimensional imaging tools that show inside the heart, the coronary arteries, and the peripheral blood vessels. So just really interesting research that they're doing. That's really going to lay the groundwork for the future for how heart disease is treated in this country. Next slide, please. So wrapping it all up, why is this important for patients? Well, what is this research? What do these trials do? Ultimately, it can lead to earlier diagnoses, less invasive treatments, and longer, healthier lives for all of the patients who are suffering the whole gamut of heart-related issues. This is where I really want to turn it over to our advocates who are on the screen, who are really going to share their firsthand experience with these NIH research and programs. So Karen, I think I'll turn it back over. Oh, Glenn, sorry.
You got it, Chris. All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks. Before I get into my topic, first off, I want to thank everyone at Troutman. So for that fly-in event, it was fabulous. We had, as a participant, it was a very meaningful event. In fact, Steve, who you'll hear from in a couple of minutes, and then another one of our advocates, Justin, and I co-authored a letter on behalf of Mended Hearts that we've already submitted to Senator Wyden's office as follow-up. They wanted to hear in writing what was it that our points of view on some pending potential legislation. So anyway, great work, everyone. Thank you. So we've got a few patient testimonials. I'm going to kick off with mine. I've had the incredible fortune of having life-saving clinical trials sponsored by the NIH, over 40 years of them at this point. I don't know how many trials I've been part of off the top. I tried to think about it for a bit. I can think of at least 4 that I've been part of, and I'm going to go to my first 2. My first 2 began where my medical journey began, literally 42 years ago at this point. I was diagnosed with stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma the week before my senior year of high school. And so for those of you old enough might remember the last time the Olympics were in LA, well, I was sitting in the hospital with stage 4 cancer. At the time, it was not a sure thing cure, almost like it's become today. I was part of a clinical trial sponsored by NIH funding. And in the case of this, you can see that the data is right there in front of you. 4 out of 10 patients actually were able to go into remission before this study. Because of it used a combination of a couple of different cocktails. The idea was outsmarting the cancer. It became more effective. And then in this combined therapy, the results of that study were 7 out of 10 patients. So we saw a marked improvement. That was the basis of modern care today, where we see over 90% those diagnosed with stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma make it. So in my case, that was, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Or is that Karen? Thank you. In my case, I came out of remission. And it had come back. It actually had come back into my right lower lung at that point. And I guess I should say stage 4, if you're not familiar, in my case, it was in my lymph nodes, it was in both lungs, it was in my liver, it was in my spleen. So it was a lot of places. It came back approximately 18 months later. And so upon reoccurrence, the traditional method was, well, let's throw more chemotherapy at it and more radiation, of which I'd already had both at this point. And instead, there was a novel way of treating lymphoma reoccurrence. This was a bone marrow transplant. Now, many of you have probably heard of bone marrow transplants today. In fact, you've probably heard of stem cell transplants. This was the first study that looked at treating Hodgkin's lymphoma with the use of autologous bone marrow transplants. This was happened to also be the year of Be the Match, or excuse me, Be the Match, as far as the National Donor Registry, was founded in 1986 as well. One other thing about 1986 before I talk about the trial, that was also the landmark paper published, and happened to be published where I was at the University of Nebraska Medical Center there in Omaha, where it was the landmark study for stem cell therapy in the use of solid organ cancers. They didn't think it could be done before that, and it was about I want to say it was a 3 to 4 year project, and the paper was published in 86. So this particular study that I was part of, and by the way, that was also an NIH study. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. But in this case, cancer reoccurrence and lymphoma was certain death over time. Might be able to slow down the growth, etc. Didn't happen. The trial I was in was, well, I think it was successful. I didn't realize this until I went back and looked and found the study paper from the trial a few weeks ago, and found that really only 40% survived. So 4 out of 10 people survived this bone marrow transplant therapy at that point. And of course, today in modern care, it's above 90%. So this through NIH partnerships really became a roadmap for universal cure rates, not just in lymphoma, but other solid organ therapies as well as liquid tumor therapies. So I thought that was important. I could have gone to heart. You'll hear more heart ones now. And so I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over and go right ahead, Karen. On the next slide. Steve, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. My story is not as eventful as Glenn's, but I'll tell you mine anyway, which is interesting. I'm Steve Weitzen. First, I wanted to say I'm a great believer and supporter of the NIH and what NIH funding has done and can do. As has been mentioned by Chris, NIH funding has led to so many things, like learning about factors of cardiovascular disease, such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, and obesity. The Framingham study was amazing. It has provided therapies for cancer, vaccines for COVID. This is all NIH studies, led to HIV and AIDS treatment, ways to detect Alzheimer's, the discovery of antibiotics, and I could go on, but I won't because I only have 5 minutes to speak. To finish my introduction, and as mentioned, you see on the screen, I'm a heart transplant recipient. I received my transplant in 2019. On the first anniversary, the actual first anniversary of my transplant, when I was finally starting to feel like my old self, the world shut down due to COVID. I barely made it through my on the first anniversary of heart transplants. They usually give you an angiogram to see how you're doing. If it had been a day later, I would not have had that because everything, all the hospitals shut down. Well, as many did, I couldn't wait for the next time when the time I can get a vaccine and feel safe. Vaccines came at the end of 2020. I received my first two in early 2021, and I found out that I was eligible for a Johns Hopkins study of organ transplant recipients who took first two vaccines. The study was sponsored in part by the NIH. I had friends who had benefited greatly from NIH studies. One is a leukemia patient who is only, she'll say, she's only alive today due to that research. And that was about 12, 13 years ago. I therefore was interested to take part, particularly because COVID can lead to cardiac problems, and I'm a heart patient. The first results of the study were announced in March, followed by further information in May, and it was found that after the first two doses of the vaccine, only 17% of the organ transplant recipients had positive antibody results. Basically, it only worked for 17% of the people. Therefore, I and most of the transplant recipients had much less protection than the normal population. Needless to say, I was not very happy. The results were attributed to the immunosuppressant medications that were taken by solid organ recipients. It doesn't allow our bodies to respond well to vaccines. But then, a few months later, in June, we had some hope. A further portion of the study showed that many patients who took an additional vaccine, that is a third shot, whether it was mRNA or Johnson and Johnson vaccines, had a notably better response. The study organizers had an inkling that this would be a result, but of course they had to actually do the study to prove that it was true. One third of those who had negative antibody responses after two doses had positive responses after a third dose. And all of those who had low positive responses had high positive responses after a third dose. And in the end, many of us gained even greater and greater results with further vaccines, although generally not as great a response as the normal population. The inkling, that is the thought that further vaccines would prime the pump of transplant patients, turned out to be correct. And this knowledge helped the FDA to pass regulations to allow highly immunocompromised people to obtain further vaccines and become safer during the pandemic and beyond. Another big win for NIH funding. So now, in the last few months, Johns Hopkins has further expanded their study with the use of NIH funds, and I'm taking part in that study. I actually took various swabs and gave some blood just yesterday. The purpose of this study is to understand which viruses are making organ transplant recipients sick in the community and how well the vaccines protect against infections. Specifically, we're talking about flu, RSV, and COVID. The study will track these infections over time and test for different types of infection fighting immunity against the viruses. And I'm looking forward to those advances. Thanks. I'm done.
Thank you, Steve. All right. So just to give you a little snapshot into a little bit of my cardiac story. About 12 years ago, I fainted in a grocery store. I woke up in a hospital, actually immediately across the street from the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. I had undergone a 12-hour emergent open heart surgery for an aortic dissection. My aortic valve was resuspended. And 2 weeks post open heart surgery, a pacemaker went in with two different leads going to different chambers in my heart. So I had challenges in both the plumbing of my heart and in the electrical system of my heart. The trick for me at that point in time, even in the Washington, D.C. area, was getting proper imaging with my device in place. It was starting to prove to be a challenge, even though my surgeon and my EP both said, you've got, all the bells and whistles in this new type of pacemaker. But then when it came time to really go back in and look at the success of my surgery and the vasculature in my body, it was tricky. There were not very many people that had hospitals, I should say, healthcare systems that had protocol in place to image folks like me. And certainly I had one of the newer variations of the pacemaker. So even folks that had had pacemakers for years, their imaging was limited. And so it happened that the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which Chris mentioned, and they do have those really cool ongoing imaging studies that caught my attention when you mentioned that, Chris. At the time when I became part of this study, it was called the PREDICT study. It was just using a new CT scan with lower levels of radiation. You know, that's the concern when you have a CT scan, radiation exposure. And folks like me, again, who have the vascular issues, need, especially post-op, a fair amount of imaging just to make sure everything is working the way it should. And so I felt really grateful to have this really cool study. There were 1,500 patients enrolled in the study, and it did go on to help with patients like me and other patients as well, and establishing protocols at various hospitals in the area. So sort of circling back, I was part of a Johns Hopkins healthcare system, and I could have potentially gotten imaging at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, but the wait was, almost a year. It was nuts. So I felt really grateful to be a part of this and to have a real snapshot into what was happening in terms of my own health as I was healing. And then eventually I learned that the protocols that started to drop into more suburban hospitals, really kind of came out of studies similar to this. So I felt really grateful to be a part of this. And yeah, so not really involved in terms of medicines and that sort of thing, but still, NIH does this type of research as well. So super grateful to be a part of that. Mark, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Karen.
Of course.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Sylvester, and I am a CHD dad. My 8.5-year-old son Dominic has a very rare congenital heart defect called truncus arteriosus. So Dominic popped on the screen earlier. He just got home. But when he was born, we found he was at Children's National Medical Center here in Washington, D.C. And while we were inpatient, we learned about the Can Do clinic that Children's had started, which stands for Cardiac and Neurodevelopmental Outcomes. Clinic that's an NIH grant funded program which kind of addresses it was built because of the correlation that they found between CHD patients and neurodiversity. And so while we were inpatient, we learned that we could be a part of this program. And what they do is basically it's a full multidisciplinary team that follows the kiddos soon after birth, maybe like a year old. I'm blanking on when our first assessment was, but you have an assessment with a neuropsychology. I'm trying to remember. There's psychology, occupational therapy, nutrition, OT, and this, like I said, this full multidisciplinary team provides assessments and then follows the patients from toddlers all the way through teenagers. And like I said, it helps to identify recommendations down the road as an outpatient with whether it's speech therapy, occupational therapy, CBTs, or any other therapies that your kiddo may need out into the community once they're outpatient and as they grow. And some of the benefits that we found with these early diagnoses, our son was also diagnosed on the autism spectrum, was that these early diagnoses really help enable those interventions before they get to their elementary school. And to be able to start those interventions early really gives them a head start on when they get to school. And then when you get to school, you can have those meetings with the special ed teams, developing IEPs and 504 plans to really get those plans and programs in place before school starts. And some kiddos that, when they're not really aware of neurodiversity, or parents especially, those kind of interventions don't start for a while. You can miss a grade or two, and obviously the earlier we can start those interventions, the better outcomes we'll see. And as part of the Can Do Clinic, they also combine the research of all the kiddos that are a part of this study and into the program, and develop research and studies to continue the linkage there between CHD and neurodiversity with the kids. So I believe we've had two assessments since our initial in the last 8.5 years, and I think the next one's coming up in another 1.5 years. So again, we're very privileged and grateful that NIH has granted this program at Children's National here in DC, and that we're local and to be able to take advantage of it. So back to you, Karen. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Steve. Really appreciate y'all sharing your stories with us. So be sure to put your questions in the Q&A. I guess I need to stop share to get those questions, perhaps, maybe. All right, let's take a look here. Hey, Sam, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Nice to see you. Let me just see if we have any other questions.
I don't think we do.
Yeah, Lisa, I don't see any questions. I think you're in the background. Mark, I had a question for you regarding Dominic and his follow-up. So
Sure.
does he have to, when he has those reassessments, you said he has one coming up, is he in clinic at the NIH, or is it a couple hours with a resource person in the school, or what does that look like?
Usually, actually, it's down at the Children's National. Their program is right there
Yeah.
at the main campus
Yeah.
in DC. I believe they're also expanding. They have some new facilities out the old Walter Reed Hospital. That whole campus is being redeveloped for Children's National Research. And then out in Silver Spring, there might be some offices too. But usually we go downtown.
Got it. Got it. Anybody else have any other questions, or our patients? Did you guys think of anything else maybe you wanted to share that was relevant in terms of what we're talking about today?
I'd like to make one comment quickly, if I might, Karen, and it's something we've not talked about, which is clearly part of NIH funding and a clinic and an NIH project, and that's in the space of basic. Turn on. Oh, sorry.
Glenn, you're gonna have to
There
explain
we go.
There,
before you go on. You're gonna have to
Guys like
explain
that
that picture
hat, by the
to
way?
us.
Yeah.
I just there we go.
Start again.
Is
Start
that
again.
part of an NIH study?
Yeah.
Yeah, that chicken hat. That's a terrible hat. So I wanted to make a moment. If folks are not familiar with another part of, and there's multiple legs, as Chris alluded to earlier about how NIH research occurs. I want to talk about basic science, and basic science is something as a patient we don't necessarily think about. Basic science is the idea of what are the fundamentals that go into applying clinical medicine. So heart, okay, basic science in heart. They now know the specific cell cluster that starts a heartbeat. That was founded through an NIH-funded grant. The work on how to then control, not at the cellular level, but at the molecular level of the cells that cause the beat of the heart, that's something that's funded today through NIH. By able to manipulate at the molecular level those cells, we can stop arrhythmias before they've ever began. It's really fascinating work. And that's the kind of work that's only available through the type of funding through NIH. Because those are long shot bets that, you think, oh, well, maybe a pharmaceutical company would invest in that. No. It's kind of like, the payoff for a moonshot, right? There's a lot of experience before private industry got into it. And those are also the kind of bets that they do at the NIH. So just wanted to round out some of our stories here today. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Glenn. No, I was geeking out with you as well. So especially when you talked about, sort of the arrhythmias, because that's a little bit of where I have one foot in my cardiac story. So really cool, all that science. Anybody else have anything to add?
One thing I would say, even though, I mean, we would mention the Framingham study before, after I had my heart transplant, I realized I didn't know much about a heart and heart development at all. And I read this one book called Heart. I recommend it greatly. I don't know the author off the top of my head, but it was fantastic. And it went through the history of how heart surgery went. And one of the things it mentioned is that when Franklin Roosevelt passed away, he passed away primarily of he had a stroke with incredibly high blood pressure. At the time, which is 1945, he had blood pressure like 200 something over nearly 200. And it was considered normal. No one even thought about it. And it was from his demise that brought around the Framingham study, which brought about all of these developments that we know. And I was shocked. And even when I was a child, I was born with heart problems, born in 1959. And my parents, I remember them talking about possibly giving me a pacemaker, and they were frightened out of their minds. And I never understood why. Well, you know why? Because 1959 was the year that they first implanted pacemakers into people, and it didn't do too well often. So we're really cardiac research is in infancy. We're really very lucky to be living now because, many of us will not be alive. So I thought that was a bit of interesting information.
Thank you for that, Steve. I'll have to look up that book. I wrote it down. I found a couple questions. Thank you, Sam. Let's see. The first question, as far as NIH funding, do cardiac studies have the bulk of research money allocated?
Yeah,
Chris, maybe.
I can try to answer that one. In terms of the overall funding at NIH, the short answer to that is no. NIH is kind of divided into several institutes. Cancer Institute, of course, being the largest one, and therefore having the majority, not the majority, but a very large portion of funding allocated to cancer. And then the NHLBI was kind of third on that overall list at $4 billion. And of course, that money is subdivided across a whole range of issues. So they're certainly one of the largest issues when you look at them all individually. But is it the bulk? No, is the short answer to that question. And then of all the funded studies conducted at within NIH campus, are all the funded studies conducted at within NIH campus in Bethesda? I think, as we've heard from a couple of our advocates here, I don't think that's the case. Excuse me. Sorry?
Steve, I can help you with that one too.
Yeah, sure.
By far, the bulk of the studies are, first off, multi-site studies when we're talking about clinical trials. So multi-sites around the country. Second of all, they're conducted with academic research centers around the country.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, over like three-fourths of NIH's funding ultimately goes out to research institutions literally across the entire country. There's not a state that doesn't get funding. So a lot of those studies, those trials, end up taking place at various locations, like Glenn mentioned.
Thank you, Chris. I believe that's it. Any other questions? I think we have, let me just look at one more place here. We're getting lots of good feedback, a lot of thank yous.
I think that covers them.
Yeah, that covers it. And Steve did put in the name of that book there in the chat if anybody's interested in grabbing that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to Lindsay and Chris and Ryan with Troutman. And then, of course, to our patients. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, everybody.
See you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good
Fred.
night.
Bye.